Koreans are much different than the Chinese. The Chinese are much different than the Filipinos. The Filipinos are much different from Vietnamese. So for me, I find that I'm more compatible with. Hi, my name is Walt Goodridge, a Jamaican living on Saipan. I'm a former civil engineer with a Bachelor of Science from Columbia University. Years ago, I quit my job to pursue my passion full-time. Eventually, I escaped the New York rat race and moved to this side of the world to explore the Asia-Pacific region. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, in fact, the fellow who introduced me to Saipan, called and wanted to know if I would mind getting on a Zoom call with a friend of his. This friend, who lives in the States, wants to get married, but he doesn't want to settle for a Western woman, so he wants to do his wife quest here on this side of the world. And my friend wants to know if I'd be open to sharing some insights, information, perspectives with him. So I said sure. Topic came up as to whether Saipan would be a good place for him to have his home base while he does his searching. So this was my response.
When I was on Saipan 2004, I think it was a much different experience as compared to what's happened post-COVID. So the question is, would Saipan be a good base for someone coming in to, find a partner?
Yes, I still believe so. Whether he actually finds someone on Saipan or whether he branches out to Japan or Vietnam or China or Thailand or the Philippines, Saipan is still the best place, I guess, as an American to stay. Now, if he's an American, he could stay long term in a lot of other places because of his passport. But as a place to start for an orientation, yes, I think it might be good. Guam could be a good option, but it's a little more. Guam has been a U.S. territory now since 1890 something, the Spanish-American War. So it's more Americanized. There are definitely more people there, but I would say it's not as diverse because Saipan has more of a range. We have Bangladeshis, we have Filipinos, we have Thailanders, we have Japanese. So it's a more eclectic society here on Saipan, even though it's much smaller. But I think, yes, it would still be a good place to start. Doesn't have to stay. If he decides Guam is more his speed, he can start there. However, as it pertains to the actual search that you're referring to, my advice is going to be for him to open up the possibilities to the countries in the region, China, Vietnam, because in my opinion, I think it's important for him to decide what his preference is and what his non-negotiables are and what his which culture he feels more of an affinity to. Now, that's my opinion. Some guys will tell you that they don't care, they don't have a preference, but just from my way of looking at it, the Koreans are much different than the Chinese. The Chinese are much different than the Filipinos. The Filipinos are much different from Vietnamese. So for me, I find that I'm more compatible with Chinese. I find I'm less compatible with Koreans and Filipinos. So for me, it wouldn't even, that seems like I'm restricting a whole segment of the population, and I am. But that's my preference. Some guys don't, but I think that might also be why a lot of people end up unhappy, because they're not aware of their standards and their preferences. They just choose the first person who attracts them, and then they realize that they're not compatible for a number of different reasons. That's just my opinion. So that's the advice I would give someone. But depending on how they perceive women, depending on how they perceive relationships, depending on how they perceive themselves, they may choose not to heed the advice. But to answer your question, I would say yes, it's a good place to start. It's on the other side of the world, and he'll get a much different, just from being here, he'll get a much different perspective on how men and women interact. At this point, I ask about his age. So that's a good point to bring up, in that here on this side of the world, that is not an issue at all. In fact, a lot of the girls in Thailand and the Philippines prefer older guys, and the age gap is not an issue at all. So that's one very good, encouraging thing about dating on this side of the world. So yeah, I think it's a good move on his part. I guess my only warning or suggestion is for him not to bring Western biases, expectations here. He's going to have to find a way to clear the slate and not view women the way that his experiences in the U.S. have shaped him. Well, that's the fun part.
So can you speak more about that? Like, give me an example of what you mean.
Okay. When you grow up in America, you have a perception of women, you have a perception of relationships, you have a perception of yourself, you have a perception of your value, you have a perception of what it requires to get a woman. You have a perception of how you should behave around women, and I believe that puts a lot of men at a disadvantage. So one of the things that I have learned here immediately is that the biggest difference between dating life in the West and dating life here on this side of the world was summed up to me by a fellow within a few weeks of me landing on Saipan. He said the big difference is in America, men are the problem. Here in Asia, men are the solution. Which means the women are not predisposed to see you as a creep. The women are not raised to compete with you to see who is the better man. The women here actually enjoy being women. They embrace their femininity. They know that men are stronger. They know that men and women are different. So they're not competing with you. That's the biggest thing. So you tell a girl, hey, you're very pretty, and you get a giggle. You get, oh, that's, and that's, but here in the States, if you do that, the SWAT team and the cops will be on you in a short while. Yeah. So that's one of the...
What's your angle?
Right, exactly. So that suspicion, he would need to drop that suspicion. He also needs to see himself as a masculine man. A lot of men in the West, especially now, are now being feminized and believe they have to beg women for attention. They believe that the women are the prize and that they are the servants. So I think it would help him to think back, if he can, to a traditional time when women were women and men were men. When I had my Thai girlfriend, I had a Thai girlfriend, and she came over to the house, and every time she came over to the house, she would start sweeping. And it would annoy me because she's just sweeping and the sound of the broom. So I told her, when you come over, I don't need a maid. You don't have to do that. Just sit here, talk to me, and just be feminine. And she said, no. This is lady work. This is lady work. And she doesn't feel oppressed doing it. She's doing it because the same way if you as a guy, if you walked into your girlfriend's apartment and you saw a door falling off the hinges, you would immediately just get a screwdriver and you go to the door and you start fixing it because that's man work. When she comes over to the apartment and she sees dirty dishes in the sink or a floor that needs sweeping, she starts sweeping because that's lady work. And no one is complaining, no one is feeling oppressed. This is just the way things are. It's a comfort factor that doesn't exist in the West. In the West, well, how it would go down a different way. So my point is there are certain realities of normal male-female interaction, call it traditional if you will, that exist. And if you bring your American mentality it'll take you more time to adjust, but you may not even see the beauty of the differences because you're viewing it through a Western lens, through an American lens. So that's just one small example of. I can think of more if I, gave myself some time. But that's one example of how your preconceived notions might prevent you from seeing the reality around you. So that's something I would definitely stress to anyone who's starting fresh here on this side of the world.
Got it.
So I'll give you an example. In fact, I was thinking of doing a video on this. I watched a YouTube video where this young lady, her channel I think is My Non-Leather Life, and she's giving advice to men about how women think. Looks very interesting channel, a lot of good information. However, when I was listening to it, certain things jumped out at me, and one of the things that she was pointing out was that there are certain things that are naturally attractive to women about men. And she went in to describe certain things, and she said a statement that was something like, if more men knew the natural things that attract women to men, it would put women at a disadvantage. Because if men knew the power that they had, and that women can't avoid noticing, it would put her at a disadvantage. And she said, I would never tell a man this because then I would be vulnerable. And what struck me about that statement was that it's interesting. She would never tell a man because that would make her vulnerable, which sounds to me, I could be wrong, but sounds to me that she is competing and she needs to have leverage over him, which is fine. I understand that, because in every relationship there is someone who has 51% of the power. People don't like to admit this, but I know that in every relationship there's someone who likes the other person more than the other person likes them. So the person who is more needy has 49%, more or less, and the other person has 51. So I know what she's talking about because I always have the 51%. In all my relationships, I am the one who can just walk away. That's just how my DNA is. So I have the walk away gene. But so I know she wants to keep leverage and power in a relationship. So I respect that. I do the same thing. The difference is that the women here, I don't see that worldview, that paradigm. They are not threatened by being vulnerable. In fact, they like men, and they want men to do the things that men do. So they're not competing with them to see who has leverage. I'm sure some might, and she might, this woman might be speaking about basic female nature that I'm just not familiar with. But it just struck me that it seemed, the minute she said, I would never tell a man that because, that would basically give him too much power and make me vulnerable. And it struck me that that's an indication of a power struggle, between the men and the women, and that doesn't exist. And I'm sure it exists on an individual basis, but it's one thing that I don't see. I don't see women competing to be men or to be the dominant one in the relationship.
Right.
Yep. So I'm really
interesting.
Really fascinating stuff. There's more to this conversation, and when we reach 800 subscribers, I'll release part 2.